Okay, so this is a slight departure from my current Range Rover series. The next video of that will be coming soon. It's going to be talking about some of the practicalities and some of the not so practical sides of owning an old Range Rover. But for now, I'm going to be telling a story about a particular Aston Martin, which is one of the rarest and certainly one of the most beautiful Aston Martins ever made. Now, this particular story is one that I've told to a few people, a few friends of mine that are in the automotive space. And every single one of them have always said, why have you never told this story publicly? So that's exactly what I'm going to do here. So it is just going to be a story video. So if that's not your thing, of course, please click away. But if you love your cars and you love Aston Martins and you want to hear a good story, lock in. So the car in question was an Aston Martin V12 Vantage S80 Spitfire Edition. Aston Martin made a series of 4 cars, which all had connections to historical aircraft. So the first car, I'll run through all of them now. The first car was a V8 Vantage S, which was based on the Blades aircraft. The Blades is an acrobatic team, very, very cool. They're silver aircraft. Of course, the car was painted silver, and it was very pretty. And it was their first one. So the second car is the car in question, which was an upgrade from a V8 Vantage S to a V12 Vantage S, and this was the Spitfire car. Now, the one that came after that was arguably even more striking, and it was based on a Vanquish S. All of this was around 2015, 2016, so it was that kind of generation of Aston Martin. So yeah, so the next car was a Vanquish S, the Red Arrow car, so one of 10 cars. Then the last car they did was a DBS, which was based on the Concorde, which of course, hugely historical, important aircraft, and the car was just as beautiful, just as you'd expect. So let's talk about the car in question. So, as I say, V12 Vantage S, so 6-litre naturally aspirated V12 in the Vantage body. These were coupes, they weren't roadsters, and they were finished in a beautiful colour called Duxford Green. And they had the beautiful yellow pinstriping down the sides of the car, which certainly when the doors were open, obviously they've got those 12 angle doors, they call them swan doors. It really did look like the wings of a Spitfire that had that sort of that leading edge yellow pinstripe down the wings of the Spitfire. There was a lot of other little sort of nods to the Spitfire with the car as well. So on the headliner inside the car was a map of Duxford. Duxford obviously I brought up there twice with the colour and also the roof lining. Now that was the place that you had to go to collect your car. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The interior leather was a beautiful, almost a bright orange sort of colour, really, really stunning. And then you had a sort of on some of the switch gear, there were sort of like logos that you'd find on a Spitfire aircraft. There are a couple of optional extras that you could have. As I say, there were only 8 cars, so there wasn't that many optional extras because there's only 8 people to own one of these vehicles. One of the options that no one ticked was to have, obviously on a V12 Vantage, you've got those louvres on the front bonnet. The option was to have those exposed carbon fibre, and no one did that. They were all body coloured, so they were all that Duxford green. That was the only colour that you could get on this car, obviously, as well. And a friend of mine, George, whose mum bought one of the cars, me and him were having a conversation last night. We did think, actually, it would be nice if someone did opt for that, just to see what that looks like, but no one did. There was quite a lot of exposed carbon fibre around the rest of the car, so it definitely would have fit. It would have tied the car in together. But there are a few options. Now, the other option, which I think is really important, was there was an option for transmission. So obviously the car was based on a Spitfire. One of the transmission options was a flat pedal gearbox. The other transmission option was a dogleg 7-speed manual. Obviously with the connection with the Spitfire, it's a very mechanical, very raw sort of vehicle. Most people chose correctly and opted for the manual gearbox. One car didn't. So 7 cars were manual, 1 car was a flappy paddle. And the person that opted for that flappy paddle gearbox was someone that was very, very high up in the MOD, in the Ministry of Defence here in the UK. And we just thought it was so funny that this person that's in charge with literally the defence of our country isn't confident enough to order his sports car with a manual gearbox. That particular car was sold because it cropped up very recently, actually, on Sam Seen Through Glasses channel. It was for sale at some local supercar dealer. And immediately we knew it was that car because it was the only one that was a flappy paddle. So That was rather interesting. But for the rest of us, we all had manuals, which was really cool. Now, I say me, it wasn't actually me. The reason I was there was because my godfather, who I was very close with, he wasn't a massive petrol head, but he was certainly a collector of beautiful things. And he was really, really into his aviation. So he'd had a lot of planes historically, and he owned still lots of helicopters. And he did like Aston Martin, so he wasn't necessarily a petrol head, but he did like them, and he was offered one of these cars, so obviously he said yes. Now, as I said, he wasn't really a huge petrol head, so he didn't really have the desire to drive the car home. So when we went up to Duxford, and again, Duxford, because Aston Martin insisted that all 8 cars stay together for as long as possible. So what that meant was that through the entire production process, those 8 cars were built separately from the production line at Gaydon, which is really interesting. Like, Aston Martin is quite a small automotive manufacturer, and the fact that they would still do something like that, I think, is really, really beautiful. And then the cars were transported together, and the cars were delivered to Duxford Airfield together. Duxford, because it was a significant hub for the Spitfire aircraft during World War II, and obviously they've got the beautiful museum there as well. As I say, if you haven't been to Duxford Museum, please, please go. It's absolutely stunning. We took off, so we flew up to Duxford. So we took off from down here in the West Country, and we flew up to Duxford Airfield. As I say, it was never the intention to drive the car home. My godfather's a bit of a collector. The car was never going to have many miles put on it. And there was a truck arranged to come and collect the car after we'd had this handover day. And that's what this story is going to be based around, is this handover day, because this is where things got a little bit interesting. So we arrive at Duxford. All 8 cars are there in a row, and they're all covered, and they eventually uncover each car. The other thing that differed every single one of those 8 cars, so it wasn't like they were numbered 1 to 8, but each car was assigned a tail number from an actual Spitfire aircraft, and they actually had some of the Spitfire pilots that fought in World War II there at the day, and some of their tail numbers of their aircraft were assigned to some of those cars, which was an amazing thing, absolutely stunning. So to hear the stories from these guys was an event in itself. Then there were 3 other things that were going to take place on the day, or 4 actually, 4 other things that were going to take place on the day. One was a tank driving experience. It was more of an armoured personnel carrier and just kind of driving off-road a little bit. It wasn't that interesting. I don't even think I took any pictures or videos of it. The other thing was a Spitfire flying experience. So they had a converted Spitfire aircraft there, which had obviously the original cockpit and then a secondary cockpit behind. You got to go up obviously into the clouds. I think it was about 20 minutes, and that was really cool, but that was reserved for the people that actually signed the £180,000 check to buy the car. So I didn't do that either. Then there was supposed to be a track driving experience on the Duxford runway in a, I say, standard V12 Vantage S Aston Martin. So after we'd had sort of the cake and biscuits and the talks from the Spitfire pilots, and we'd done the tank experience and we'd done the Spitfire flying experience, it was then time for the track driving experience. So these 2, I believe, employees of Aston Martin took out the car to do a sighting lap. Now, if any of you haven't driven on a runway, there's a couple of things that make it very different to just driving on a road. 1, it's very, very flat, and 2, it's very, very wide. So it's very difficult to gauge a sense of distance when you're driving, especially quickly on a runway. Driving quickly on a street or on a country or even an ordinary track, you've got things relatively close to the track that give you a sense of perception. So these guys, they on their sighting lap, they didn't do a sighting lap at all. They literally just gunned it straight down the runway. I believe they got up to about 170, 180 miles an hour when they realised, okay, we're getting close to the end of the runway, we should probably stop. And they hit standing water, aquaplaned, went straight through the end of the runway, straight through a hedge, into a field, through another hedge, and eventually came to rest in then the next field. I believe they were okay. I think there were some injuries, but I believe they were okay. But the car was completely toast, a complete write-off. I believe the car was silver. It was a beautiful car. I remember seeing it there before they took it on its final drive. So that didn't happen. So then the other thing is, they kind of kept it quite quiet, but eventually it got out that, there's been an accident. We can't do the track driving. Okay, fine. It is what it is. Then what they wanted to do was they wanted to line all 8 cars up on the runway at Duxford and fly one of the Spitfires right over the cars, which was an amazing experience. We were all stood off to the side. Thank you for George for this video. I'm actually there in the blue jacket. I couldn't find my video of this. I have a feeling that my phone might have died, and that's why I couldn't get footage of this. So thank you, George, for digging this one out. After that, all the cars were driven back to a little courtyard right next to where the museum is, and people who, their owners of their new cars, took them and drove them away. Obviously, that wasn't the case for us. We had a truck coming, so my godfather at this point, he's kind of a bit done with the day. He jumps in. I think he brought 2 helicopters to this event, actually, oddly enough, and he took off. And I opted to stay. I said, hey, no, I'm going to hang out here. I want to make sure the car gets loaded correctly, you know, and I just want to make sure that everything goes swimmingly. You know, I was massively into cars, as I still am now, but I immediately had just an emotional connection with this car, which a lot of you might think is really bizarre, and some of you might sit there and go, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. So I stayed. And that was great because it meant that I got to drive the car for a very short distance from this little compound next to the museum down towards where the car park is, where this truck's going to be arriving. Of course, like any 20-something-year-old, I pushed the boat out and started doing quite quick laps up and down one of the taxiways until the people from Duxford told me to stop, which I did. So pull into the car park, truck's there, line the car up to go onto the back of the truck, and I get out to let the guy obviously do the final bit, because obviously I don't want to be responsible for any damage, and he immediately just goes, no, this car is not going on this truck. Not a chance. And I'm there like, oh, okay, that's a bit of a problem. Now, this truck driver, he worked for my godfather, and knew that my godfather flew helicopters, and I said to him, I said, hey, you know, he's just taken off. Like, we're not going to be able to get in touch with him for probably over an hour. And the truck driver was like, no, it's not going to go on this truck. There's no point in me being here. I'm off. So then I'm sat there in this car park with this Aston Martin, and I think, what on earth am I going to do? So I drive back to Duxford, kind of with my tail between my legs, because obviously they just told me to stop driving up and down this taxiway next to this Lancaster bomber, which I just thought was so cool. And I kind of said to them, hey, look, I'm really sorry, but the truck that we've arranged to collect this car, it won't go on the back of the truck. There was a very, very beautiful exposed carbon fibre splitter on the bottom of the Aston Martin, and there's no way it would have cleared sort of the loading ramp of this particular truck. And they said, quite comically, they said, we can't hold the car because our insurance won't let us. And I was like, okay, you've got multi-million pounds worth of aircraft in this room, and you're not letting me stick this Aston Martin here for one night until we can arrange for another truck to come the following day. They said, no, really sorry, can't do it, not going to happen. What you can do is take the car out of the compound, out of Duxford, drive down the road, and there's a security office at the other end of the airfield. They'll be able to hold the car for you. Go and speak to them. Of course, you didn't have to tell me that twice, because it was another excuse to take this car for a drive. And talking about the drive of that car a little bit, the car never felt it never felt ferociously fast. This car was naturally aspirated, so the power band was very linear, but it did have this amazing option, which is a bit of a gimmick, but it was quite cool looking back on it now, whereby if you pressed the sport button and held it down, I think it was the sport button, you used to be able to keep your foot buried into the accelerator, and when you got up to that red line, the rev counter actually worked backward. You'd be able to snap change into your next gear without even having to take your foot off the accelerator or even put your foot on the clutch. So it would automatically actuate that clutch. It was a bit of a gimmick, but it was quite cool. So obviously, I shoot down the road, kind of thrashed it, won't lie, and I got to the security's office. And they came out and I explained the situation. They said, not a chance. They said, no way. We know that event's been going on down there with these Aston Martins. We know that these cars are worth fortunes. We don't want to know. So I'm there like, okay, well, what do I do? And they're like, look, go back to Duxford. You know, it was their event. They've got to have some kind of responsibility. I'm like, okay, cool. So another excuse to thrash it back down the road, down to the other side of Duxford. When I get to the entrance, though, something really quite interesting had happened. They'd closed the gate. So I was completely locked out of Duxford Airfield. And I can remember at this moment thinking back to when I was at school. And I can remember several times, you know, whether it was at boarding school or whatever, you know, I just wish there was a car outside which had the keys in it and a full tank of fuel, and I could just jump in it and escape, you know, as we do when we're children. You know, we don't necessarily love every minute we spend at school. And I realised that dream, that fantasy, had in fact come true. I'm stood there with this Aston Martin outside. It's got a full tank of fuel. And I'm like, wow, this was my dream. This was my childhood dream. But in actual fact, this is a complete nightmare. So I didn't really know what to do. So I continued to drive the car up and down the road until I eventually came to my senses and thought, yeah, no, this is probably a really bad idea. And I managed to phone one of the guys that was heading up this project, who worked at Jardine Aston Martins. Someone I actually reached out to fairly recently, a chap called Simon Lane, and he was like, yeah, I'm still in the area, don't worry, I'll come get the car. And then we took it to a local Aston Martin dealer, the Cambridge Aston Martin dealership, and there the car stayed, and then it got picked up, I think a day or two later. It was a really, really wild time, like absolutely wild. And the one thing that really stuck with me is, so my godfather kept that car for many years. And as I said, he eventually ended up having the Blades car, the Spitfire car, which was this one, and also the Red Arrow Vanquish S, which was the one of 10 cars made. And I can remember getting in the Aston Martin in his collection many, many times and looking at the mileometer and it reading 43 miles. I didn't do all of those miles because there were some miles on each of the cars because they test cars. Obviously, Aston Martin, they're quite a small manufacturer, so they do test their special, their special series cars or cars that they have for their special clients. But I don't think the car ever did any more miles than that. And the cars were sold as a 3, so the Blades, the Spitfire and the Red Arrow, they were sold as a 3 many years later, and they were sold to a collector who I believe the same as just kept them in a garage. So it's nice to know that I got to spread that Aston Martin's wings just once, just one time, and they may never be spread again, which is a shame because what an absolutely beautiful machine.